Hello.
You guys hear me okay?
What? Does your team need to master AngularJS? Oasis Digital offers Angular Bootcamp, a 3-day in-person workshop class for individuals or teams. Bring us to your site or send developers to ours, angularbootcamp.com. This episode is sponsored by Wijmo5, a brand new generation of JavaScript controls. A pretty amazing line of HTML5 and JavaScript products for enterprise application development in that Wijmo5 leverages ECMAScript 5 and each control ships with AngularJS directives. Check out the faster, lighter, and more mobile Wijmo 5. Hey everybody, and welcome to episode 28 of the Adventures in Angular podcast. This week on our panel we have Aaron Frost.
Hello.
Ward Bell.
Hello.
Lucas Rubelkey.
Hey there.
I'm Charles Max Wood from devchat.tv with a quick reminder to go check out JS Remote Conf. That's at jsremoteconf.com. We also have a special guest this week, and that's Jeff Whelpley.
Salutations.
Do you want to introduce yourself real quick, Jeff?
Sure. My name is Jeff Whelpley. I'm the chief architect at GetHuman. I've been a software developer for about 13 years or so, working on everything from PHP to Java to .NET to C++. But the past 2 years at GetHuman, I've kind of focused in on just JavaScript for everything. And that's kind of what we've been building out our new platform in.
All right. So we brought you on to talk about isomorphic JavaScript and Angular. And I have to ask, because I didn't get a really good idea of this, Googling around, what in the heck is isomorphic JavaScript?
So, yeah, it's a good question to start off with. And before talking about even Angular, let's just define kind of what isomorphic is and what isomorphic JavaScript is. So, like, isomorphic is just a term meaning, being of identical, similar form and shape and structure. And so when you're talking about with JavaScript, it means using the same JavaScript code in different contexts or containers. And kind of the simple example of that is if you just have, let's just say a simple function of taking in a parameter of A and B, and you add A and B and return the result. That's total simple function, and that function by nature is isomorphic because you can take that and throw it anywhere, whether it's in a browser or Node.js on the server or in PhoneGap or wherever JavaScript will run. But with a lot of other things, it's a little bit tougher. Like if you are using Angular code, the Angular context is not every place. So when you do Angular dot, you need to have Angular bootstrapped before you can get started. And so Angular by itself, before you do anything, is not isomorphic. But there are things you can do in order to make Angular or anything else isomorphic so that you can actually run it in those different contexts. And really, at the end of the day, the goal of isomorphic JavaScript is sort of creating ultra-dry code. Do not repeat yourself. And I know we all try to do that, but pretty much everybody kind of inevitably creates either whether it's a data validation or whatever it is, we end up duplicating code across our environments.
So it goes beyond server-side rendering of Angular templates.
Yeah, that's the thing, is that server-side rendering is sort of the thing most people focus on when they talk about isomorphic JavaScript. But the way that I treat it, and really when you get into it, you think about it, is with all of your code. And rendering is an important part of that, but data is another big part of that. How your data models, the definitions and validations involved with it, as well as interfaces for, calling out to an API versus the database, as well as routing, like server-side routing versus client routing is different. You're using your Express router versus your Angular UI router or whatever. But in order to do isomorphic right, you have to create interim or modules that can be utilized both of those routing mechanisms regardless of where it is. So it goes beyond just the server rendering.
So Jeff, I have seen a portion of this. Obviously, I was around kind of at the genesis when you started to play around with this idea. In the course of the last year, like how much overlap have you actually got? How successful have you been in this? I mean, it sounds pretty fantastical.
Yeah, it's a good question because if you guys didn't know, Lucas worked with me on this actually about a year ago. And
so
at that
was
time,
a softball question. Lucas knows.
Well, sort of. So at the point where he was working with me, we were in like iteration 1 of this. And we had figured out some things, like the data side was something that we did a really good job of while Lucas was there, figuring out how to make all of the data objects isomorphic, that we can use them at the different layers, and routing to a degree, but the view layer was still not working. And that's sort of why Lucas was asking that question, I think, because we were still duplicating our views. We had a completely separate view on the server versus the client. So that the past year, what we really focused on was pulling that together. And that was the most difficult part, to be quite honest. But we finally did figure that out, and it's working pretty well now.
So I have to ask, though, it seems like between the front end and the back end, a lot of times you have different concerns. So is this only the code for, say, certain behaviors that you want to share between the front end and the back end? So, for example, validating something on a data model of some kind. You know, you probably want to be able to do that on the front end so you can give immediate feedback, and you want to do it on the back end so you're not putting crap into whatever database you're using.
Yeah, it's a good question. Even though you're writing everything in this common format, it is true that depending on what container you're running your code in, there are certain things that just, you either need or don't need. So just as an example of where you might not need something, on the client side, you have a lot of times UI events, a user click, or some other event is caused by the user doing something. Whereas on the server, that's not needed at all. So even though you create a common format that, for the HTML and the template, so that it can render in both places, on the server side, it's much simpler, to be quite honest, because you're just doing the initial state, the initial render, and you don't even have to worry about the other stuff. Now, as far as data validation, that's definitely something that is done in both places, but how it's actually implemented could be different. So on the client side, for using Angular, you could utilize the Angular form validation controls, whereas on the server, you might have, like on Mongo in Mongoose, they have a way of doing validation within Mongoose, right? But you can write your code in sort of a configuration format, like type format, where you're just writing, let's say, for a given model, like let's say the model is called user. And in your user model, there is a field username that's required and has a regex and some other validations. You can write that from a developer in a very format that's totally agnostic of what container it's in, just a simple configuration. But then once you have it running within a container, there are adapters that hook into it. And that's part of building an isomorphic framework, is that you have to have container-specific adapters so that on the client side, that validation will automatically generate an Angular form validator. Whereas on the server side, it would hook into Mongoose. But from a developer standpoint, you don't even see that stuff. That's part of the framework itself that actually implements it in those two ways. I'm just writing something in a very generic format. Does that make sense?
I'm still trying to understand the value proposition, Jeff. And by the way, I hope that on the show we put the link to your PowerPoint or your slides or whatever, because that's very helpful in sort of framing and filling in. So I'm thinking about what you're striving for, and I'm trying to find out when I would need what you're talking about, because I can't. There are extremes. At one level, there are certain kinds of things. There's a great slide you have of the 8 things that you really target. And I get security, the overlap of some code and security and data validation, possibly model definition, because you kind of want those things to be symmetric. And if you've got JavaScript on both sides, great. But I can't figure out why I'm going to essentially attempt to even fake executing the entire application on the server. Can you tell me why that would be important to me?
Well, a couple of things. So it's a very good question. And you're not faking the entire application right off the bat. It's just a portion of it, because you're trying to render just the initial state of a given route. So there's really, let's break this down into 2 primary motivations for doing isomorphic JavaScript, okay? One motivation is developer productivity. The other is to make your users happy. So for developer productivity, it centers around what you kind of started to talk about, Ward, which is you're eliminating duplicated code, you're making things dry, you're trying to make yourself more efficient. Now, when I talk to other developers about this aspect of things, it sometimes gets debatable, because some people argue that just copying and pasting in certain circumstances or having some small level of duplicated code, like the effort to do isomorphic is not worth, getting that ultra dryness. Now, in that aspect, I think that in some cases that might be valid. From my own personal experience, the past year of doing this has been, my most productive year as a developer because of these sort of approach. So I can't speak for everybody or every situation as far as kind of productivity, but I just know from my own situation, the way we've been doing things, it has been a huge increase in productivity from the developer standpoint. But the other reason, which was actually our primary motivator to begin with, so we didn't do this initially thinking, oh, we want to be ultra productive. We did it actually for concern for our users. And specifically, that is because we have a consumer-facing app, which that makes a big difference whether it's a consumer-facing app versus just internal. And so a consumer-facing app where most of our traffic comes from search engines. Most of our traffic comes from people Googling us. They don't know who we are. We're in the top of the search results and they come to our page. So in that situation in particular, there's the extra motivation for isomorphic JavaScript because server rendering is so important. And again, there's many reasons why since we started this that have been, huge benefits. But the initial motivation was doing server rendering with an application and combining that with a rich application that also has kind of many of the modern features that you normally have with a single page application. So we do things in real time and have it as a very rich experience. And so combining those two, you really need isomorphic JavaScript.
I buy the SEO argument, although I heard that Angular has, or Google has something out that's supposed to take care of that.
I'm glad you brought this up.
So I want you to get there. But just a sec. But if you take SEO off the table and maybe, that initial page load so that the application appears to be doing something, which you could do with a splash screen, let's face it, I'm still not clear about why it's of utility. All right, because if I'm dealing with an app, once I'm in the app, if it's my bank account app, I don't really do SEO over my bank account, right? I'm not interested in having Aaron surf in deep link into my bank account. So
why? I've got 4 kids. I need your money.
So I'm curious about that. But okay, you've got a consumer-facing app. That's critical. You need SEO. That's critical. But beyond providing whatever people are supposed to search, how am I supposed to get excited about this? And then you can tell me about Google's solution for SEO.
Yeah, definitely. So it all depends on the situation. The one you described as a bank app is not exactly the sweet spot. So the sweet spot for what I'm talking about is when you have a consumer-facing app that really depends on people coming there for the first time, either organically or through, ads or whatever it is, where they don't necessarily know who you are and they very often have a high bounce rate, like if you don't do things right. And in that case, there's many studies out there about how important the initial page load performance is. So it doesn't matter if, once your application is loaded, this is typically the case with a single page application, especially an Angular single page application, that, after the initial bootstrap and page load, typically it's pretty fast as you're kind of navigating around. But the reality for many websites and really for all of ours is that a large majority of users don't get past that first page load. Like if you don't get them in the first page load, like capture them somehow, then they're lost. And so in those cases, initial page load is hugely important. And in fact, Google has done a lot of studies about how 250 milliseconds for actually seeing something on the screen right off the bat is the difference between, whether it's much less than that or much greater has, a big impact on your user retention. Now, you brought up putting up a splash screen or something like that. And that's actually a common trick, right? For, putting up something that's not the actual content, but just like, okay, something's loading or whatever. And that works sometimes, again, depends on the app. But the power of doing isomorphic JavaScript is when you go to a page that's rendered, on the server and then having the client kind of take over is that it kind of instantly appears. There's a net positive effect to users when they see that kind of pop there and it's just all there. Like it's not, a waiting page or splash screen. It is the actual content. And then, yeah, the actual interactions and client-side stuff doesn't kick in until, Angular bootstraps, but by that time, the user has looked over the initial page and then it's ready to go. So for something like that, like our use case, it is the difference between, life and death or whatever. But yeah, for a number of applications, I could totally see that it doesn't make as much of a difference.
I understand that. I understand the initial load case and the study you're describing. And I'm going to bracket the question of whether, why it is that a server at a great remove is capable of composing the page and delivering it faster than I can compose it on the client when I'm receiving less data. And the gate, the block there is how fast can I have the traffic over the network, I would have thought. But so I think that's an interesting question in and of itself, but let's bracket that and say, yep, if initial page load is your issue, you may really want to have server-side rendering for those initial arriving pages. Tell us about the, from an SEO perspective, though, which is different. Tell us a little bit about that Google business that we're supposed to be at the end of 2014.
Sure. Just tacking on to our discussion of performance. Performance is really big for SEO. It's one of the biggest positive signals that Google, on-page positive signals that Google takes into account. So even though Google is indeed, indexing some client-side rendered HTML, the fact that most single-page applications still take a while for that initial page load has an impact on SEO. So, you can get around that. There's ways to, make your bootstrap process faster and optimize that. But, most people starting out, that isn't the case, right? Now, taking performance aside, one thing I would say is that eventually there's no doubt that client-side rendering will be totally sufficient for SEO, and there won't be that big of a difference whether you have a server-side or a client-side app. But right now, that's not the case. So if you look at any competitive search terms, especially like e-commerce terms, let's say, something you would look on eBay for, it's all server-side rendered websites that are at the top ranking. The moment that a client-side rendered application beats one of those server-side websites for one of those competitive terms, like one of the e-commerce, buying a TV or something like that, then that's our signal of okay, we can forget about server-side rendering. It's all good on the client. And I mean, there's a lot of subtlety to why that is not the case yet. But really what it comes down to is that, Google depends on artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence depends on a set of learning data that's learned over time. And the amount of data that it has for client-side rendered apps is minute compared to server-side rendered websites. So they have a distinct advantage just because of the fact that the search algorithms just know and understand server-side rendered websites so much better. But I definitely grant you that eventually that will change. Eventually it will be perfectly fine to just rely on a single-page app. But I don't think that'll be still for another couple of years at least.
All right, I'm going to change topics a little bit and head us more into the direction of isomorphic JavaScript and AngularJS. So how do the two mix?
Okay. So when you're talking about how any framework kind of implements isomorphic JavaScript, it can occur either built within the framework itself, like React is a good example of the framework just by the nature of the way the framework works is very good at rendering, on the server and doing things isomorphically. But other frameworks like Ember or Backbone, they can be rendered on the server and you can have isomorphic components, but they usually require a little extra help. So that's why, Ember, they've written a new component called Fastboot, and Backbone has another library called Render. And so those extra kind of add-on components help with the server-side rendering and some of the other components that go along with it. For Angular, when you try to do that, there's some things about Angular that actually surprisingly make things, not too bad. Namely, the fact that everything is dependent on dependency injection. That actually allows you to create something on the server side utilizing dependency injection and kind of switch things in and out. The tough thing, and then really the big challenge, is the fact that Angular routing depends so heavily on the DOM. The templating engine for Angular reads the DOM. It doesn't read like a string. Like most other frameworks have like a template, like a handlebars template that produces, a string or whatever. And that's much easier to deal with, right? So for Angular, when we started looking at this, there's kind of three phases we went through. One was that, and this was way, way early on, even before, Lucas was working with us, that, you can try to just put Angular in a box, like using a headless browser and kind of just let it generate as if it's on the client side, but like something like Phantom.js, and capture that HTML and reuse that for your server side. And that works to a degree. I mean, that's what like sites like prerender.io use. But there's a lot of problems with that. Namely, the performance is terrible. It's something that you couldn't use in real time. At runtime, you have to cache the pages, and then you run into lots of issues of how you manage all your cached HTML and that type of thing. So that for us wasn't going to work. So the next thing is to try to do something like Ember is doing now, or like Airbnb did with Render and Backbone, which is to build something kind of within the framework, work alongside it. And actually, this is something when I talked to Matthias about this, about a year ago, he was strongly an advocate of doing things this way. And I tried to do it. I tried to essentially overwrite certain components within the Angular framework in order to render stuff on the server. And maybe it's possible, I guess, but I eventually stopped after I realized that I was going to practically rewrite the entire framework. It just was getting too messy and just was not going to be something that would be sustainable. So what we ultimately ended up on, which has worked out extremely well, is to have a sort of preprocessor. So what that means is you have your code in a Node.js format, so like a server-side format, and then you utilize an adapter, what we call a transformer, to essentially build during your build step the Angular code. So essentially all the Angular code that we use on the client side is auto-generated from our kind of common format. And obviously that common format has an adapter on the server side that knows how to handle it. So that just kind of understanding that, like all of the different elements like data and routing, we were able to come up with easy ways of translating one and the other. The tricky part, again, was with the view rendering. And the key for that came by creating our own template abstraction that is called Jangular, which looks a lot like, I've used the React.dom functions for rendering in React. It sort of looks like that. It's basically functions that mimic or match each of the different kind of HTML elements, and you can string them together. And by utilizing that and having our templates in this Jangular format, that gives us the abstraction we need to make that sort of switch of building out on the client side a Angular template and Angular code, and then the server, just kind of naturally building it out in a way that can be used in, well, really whatever server-side framework you're using. We happen to be using happy.js on the server, but you really could use whatever. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Yeah, it did to me. And looking at that code snippet that was on your slides, that one really it reveals it, and it does look very React-like. I guess React wasn't around when you started. I hear something about mixing Angular and React. Did that ever occur to you, or was it just too late? Yeah,
so like 2 years ago when I started, it wasn't around, and there really wasn't any good isomorphic framework around. There was Derby, Meteor, but like they weren't that good at it, even though they sort of did it. So I decided I was going to, just make it work with Angular. And since then, React has come out. And there was a time that I thought about switching, but I did a really deep analysis, and what I came to the conclusion of is that all the stuff that they were doing in React, you can pretty much do it in Angular too. So I tried to essentially take the best of both worlds and take the best pieces out of how React works and sort of bring it to Angular.
Yeah, I could see how that might be, because unlike in React on the client, you don't have to worry about detecting DOM changes and caching that and all the trickiness that they do. You just have to render it once and send it, right?
Yep.
Yeah, that's the really hard part. The scary part about React is all the work they do to compare, fictive imaginary DOM images. And that, fortunately, you don't have that. So, yeah, that made sense, even if it made me feel squirrely about putting loop logic in JavaScript.
Well, it's interesting with that as an FYI. Like, I did actually there is a way to actually do a virtual DOM diffing in Angular. Like, it sounds weird about that, but to be honest, when I tried it out, I didn't find any performance gains. It wasn't worth it. So I do have certain constructs in there to do something somewhat like a one-way data flow, like is in React, but I still use data binding. I still use a lot of the Angular constructs. So it's really kind of a hybrid of different stuff that I'm kind of bringing together.
No, that makes perfect sense. Were there any stumbling around? I'm thinking about this as I was trying to imagine how to do it. From my perspective, the things, because I don't do stuff that's consumer facing, but I do care about having the same data validation and some model definition and utility, some of the set of things that you mentioned that have value on both sides. When I code them for the browser side, I'm usually tying into the whole Angular framework and all the components and modules and stuff like that. How easy was that to transport or execute on the server? Did that get out of your way? Was it in your way?
Actually, it worked out great because all of our data, we almost write no code for on a daily basis as we're kind of making changes and that type of thing, because we rely on, maybe it's a bad name now I'm thinking about it, but we use this resource file, not an internationalization resource file, like an actual a file that basically contains a configuration for your data object. So it contains these fields, and it uses these validations, and it even has like security stuff in there, all in just a big like config file format. And then you have a bunch of adapters that kind of work off of that resource file. So just as an example of some of the stuff, like on the API side, we have an adapter that works off that resource file and automatically generates API endpoints. Similarly, on the Angular side, we have the Jangular process that generates all of the Angular code, will look through those resource files and automatically generate API clients. And in that way, when you're using the Angular code, it will use a similar interface, or the same interface really, that's on the client and server. And just behind the scenes, it'll know that, okay, I'm on the client, I'm making an API call, versus on the server, it knows I'm on the server, I'll call the database. And so for validations, specifically using the Angular validators, that auto generation process has a thing that looks at the validations, and it'll automatically generate a series of custom Angular not all of them. Sometimes it hooks into the built-in Angular validators, but for a lot of stuff, it'll build a custom Angular validator. And then in our forms and that type of thing, in our templates rather, you can reference those just like you normally do in Angular. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I at least that's a clue, and now I can go look at your stuff and see how that works. By the way, are you publishing your stuff, this glue code? Is it available out there where other people can look at it?
It's all available right now. I don't think it's ready for other people to use quite yet, so it's something where, and I'll put it in the show notes, and people can certainly kind of look it through and even try some of the parts out, especially the lower level libraries, like the stuff that's is pretty solid, like the template generator is pretty solid and a couple other pieces. But some of the higher level stuff is a little bit probably too much in flux to utilize. But yeah, I'll maybe put some links in there and make sure I update the documentation. So if anyone wants to check it out, you can see what I mean.
That's cool. Hey, Jeff, have you talked to the Angular team about what you're doing, and have they thought about what they're going to do to cover this ground in 2.0? Do you have any insights on that?
The last time I talked to them was at NGConf last year, and the message I got then from when I talked to Brad and Mishko was that, they during the 1.2, when they were building Angular.1.2, they tried for a while to build out a server-side rendering component within Angular core, and they sort of gave up on it just because it wasn't turning out to their liking. They didn't think it just went against some of their philosophies, I think, and also I think just Angular as a whole is trying to push really for the client-side stuff. They want the web to really move towards being client-side only, and that's fine for them, and they're trying to kind of push that just as a general philosophy, but kind of the reality of kind of today's world, this is still, very relevant for a number of companies, which is why kind of I built it. And I explained kind of what I was doing, and they were very encouraging but I didn't get any sense that they were going to do it themselves. And as far as in 2.0, they are not, definitely doing server rendering from what I've seen. But I've talked to Igor a little bit, and some of their components actually are built in a way that can be used a little bit more isomorphically. So, like one example of something that I'm trying out now that seems to be working is the new dependency injector for 2.0 is actually able to be used, on the server side as well. So that's kind of cool. Like I built my own dependency injector to use on the server side for now, but I might be switching over to theirs once kind of 2.0 is more solidified.
So
that makes you the man for now.
The DIJS part of 2.0, it's all ready. I mean, we're using it for some app at Domo, and so their DIJS, that's actually ready for people to begin using and dropping in.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's good to hear. All right, anything else that we really need to cover before we get to the picks?
The one last thing I was going to mention that we didn't talk about is there is one kind of cool side effect of all this, which is that not for everything, but for a certain code, I'm able to test what's really client-side code on the server. And, again, it depends if you need to, sometimes you want to have the client-side dependencies when you're testing so that you actually run it in the context of the client. But for certain things, you don't need to, and because everything is in this common kind of server-side format, even though it's ultimately client-side code, we can run our tests without Karma or like kind of the browser, and that makes them faster, makes it easier to run, and we've seen it kind of make our code like more stable. So that's kind of the one cool side effect that we didn't talk about.
All right, well, let's go ahead and do some picks. Aaron, do you want to start us off with picks?
I'm going to pick Woot.com because I just got a new TV and it's almost in town, and I'm pumped about that. It's my pick.
All right. I forgot to ask. We usually ask Joe if there's any news about NGConf.
NGConf, I don't know about news. It's going to be amazing. If you want to host a remote viewing party, go ahead and head over to the site and sign up. By the time this podcast is out, there will be a map for people to go and see all their local remote viewing parties if there are any. So maybe you can go join one and get a t-shirt while you're there. But yes, the site's going to be updated with a lot of those NGConf extended updates so that you can discover the meetups around you. And also, if you don't have one, be confident in creating one, that knowing there's not already one in your area. So that's the only real announcement that we have. Other than that, if you got tickets, buy your hotels because the hotel rooms are almost gone.
I also want to point out, I don't know, this might be a little premature, but Joe finalized things with me at least so that we could do an Adventures in Angular episode at NGConf. And we'll be doing that during lunch one of the days. So keep an eye out for that. If you like the show, then you can like it at NGConf.
Yeah, that'll be awesome, by the way.
Yeah, I'm excited.
Got to get your stickers ready, man.
Stickers. Yeah, I do. Of course, one other thing, and I just want to kind of give a pat on the back to the NGConf organizers, Aaron, Joe, and the rest of the gang, as well as the organizers of the Mountain West Ruby and JavaScript conference. They actually scheduled themselves around each other, which is very convenient for me since they're all in Salt Lake, and I usually attend Mountain West. So Mountain West JavaScript is the 2 days before NGConf, and Mountain West Ruby is Monday and Tuesday the week after. So,
hey, Chuck, that's actually when I met you for the first time, was at Mountain West JavaScript last year.
Awesome. I thought you sounded familiar. All right. Ward, what are your picks?
All right. Well, from a technology perspective, I want to say that I'm finding Gulp increasingly a part of my life. And it's kind of interesting. There's a Gulp 4 on the way. Now sit down, because just what we need is another version of something, right? By the looks of it, it handles a very important problem, which is parallel tasks, coordinating parallel tasks. And also, it's not a hard conversion, and John Papa will be talking about that at some point. But it's there on the horizon, and it looks good, but you'll be able to keep running your Gulp 3, and Gulp is really good stuff. My non-tech thing is, and this is really odd, is a kids movie, Paddington, which I saw with my niece. And I have to say that keeps an adult entertained while it keeps the kids absolutely riveted to the screen. Nicole Kidman is a little on the dark side, which is the way I like her, but she won't totally scare the kids. Anyway.
Very nice. Yeah, so it's not as dumb as the previews make it look?
No, it's got it. It's got some cleverness. Like remember Bullwinkle and Rocky? They always had lines in there for. I mean, not saying it's like that, but they always had lines in there for adults that the kids missed, but that we made it tolerable for us to sit next to an 8-year-old and watch something.
Awesome. All right, I'm sure I have a pick. Oh yeah, Slack. So I have a new client that wanted to use some kind of chat room, which I've set up for clients before, but they never actually used them. This client seems to actually be using theirs, and we're using Slack, and it's awesome. I've also used FlowDoc, IRC. I've looked at Gitter, and there are a whole bunch of other ones out there, but Slack is just being awesome. So I'm going to pick them. They also have a Mac app and an iOS app, which means that I can kind of keep tabs on what's going on with that contract as I go. So anyway, that's my pick. Jeff, what's your pick?
I read an awesome article on Medium the other day called What I Learned About the Future by Reading 100 Science Fiction Books. Basically, this guy just read, a lot of the most prominent science fiction authors, a lot of their more recent books, and he not only kind of coalesced a lot of their predictions of the future into this kind of one overarching, this is what's going to happen in the future, which is kind of interesting. But then he also talks about how the process of creating science fiction is actually important for envisioning and building the actual reality of the future. So it's just a super interesting article all the way around, and I highly recommend it.
All right. Well, I don't think we have any other announcements. I am toying with the idea of putting together kind of an in-person meetup out here in Utah, probably in Park City or something. So if you're interested in coming to something like that, where we just kind of get together, have some dinner together for an evening, and then maybe rent a conference room or something somewhere where we can have kind of a hack night or just chat, then shoot me an email, chuck@devchat.tv. Otherwise, have a great day, and we'll catch y'all next week. This episode is sponsored by Mad Glory. You've been building software for a long time, and sometimes it gets a little overwhelming. Work piles up, hiring sucks, and it's hard to get projects out the door. Check out Mad Glory. They're a small shop with experience shipping big products. They're smart, dedicated, will augment your team, and work as hard as you do. Find them online at madglory.com or on Twitter at madglory. Hosting and bandwidth provided by the Blue Box Group. Check them out at bluebox.net. Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CacheFly.com to learn more. Do you want to have conversations with the Adventures in Angular crew and their guests? Do you want to support the show? Now you can. Go to adventuresinangular.com/forum and sign up today.